At 9:34 this morning, Canada's Minister of Natural Resources stood in Parliament and announced that effective immediately, all lithium hydroxide exports to the United States are suspended pending renegotiation of critical mineral trade agreements. Quote, Canada will no longer subsidize American electric vehicle dominance while our own battery manufacturing sector receives tariff discrimination. This export suspension remains in effect until equitable trade terms are established. Within 90 minutes of that announcement, Tesla's Gigafactory in Austin, Texas, began shutting down battery production lines. By 11:47 a.m., production had stopped completely. By 1:23 p.m., Tesla's Fremont plant in California announced a 72-hour production halt. And at 2:15 p.m., Elon Musk posted on X, quote, Canada just weaponized the mineral supply chain. This is economic warfare. U.S. government must respond immediately or the EV industry collapses. Subscribe to this channel immediately because what I am about to walk you through is not a trade dispute or a tariff negotiation. This is Canada deploying critical mineral leverage as a geopolitical weapon. This is the United States discovering that its electric vehicle future depends entirely on a neighbor who just demonstrated it can turn off the tap. And this is Tesla, the company that revolutionized the EV industry, now watching its production lines go dark because 73% of the lithium hydroxide it uses comes from Canadian processing facilities. Turn on notifications, set them to all because the crisis that began at 9:34 a.m. in Ottawa has now spread to Texas, California, Nevada, and is about to force Washington to choose between capitulating to Canadian demands or watching the entire domestic EV sector grind to a halt. Here is what happened in the 3 hours between Canada's announcement and Tesla's production shutdown, because the timeline reveals how quickly mineral dependency becomes operational crisis. At 9:34 a.m., Minister Jonathan Wilkinson made the announcement in Parliament Canada produces 8% of global lithium but processes 31% of battery-grade lithium hydroxide through facilities in Quebec and Ontario. Those processing plants supply Tesla, GM, Ford, and Rivian. The suspension applies to all lithium hydroxide exports, not just Tesla, but Tesla is the most vulnerable because it operates just-in-time inventory systems with 12 to 18 days of lithium supply on hand at any given moment. At 10:11 a.m., Tesla's supply chain team in Austin received automated alerts that Canadian shipments scheduled for today and tomorrow had been canceled. At 10:34 a.m., battery production supervisors were notified that lithium hydroxide reserves would be depleted within 11 days if no new shipments arrive. At 10:58 a.m., Tesla executives held an emergency call. The decision was made to halt production immediately rather than burn through reserves, gambling that diplomatic pressure would resolve the crisis before inventory runs out. At 11:47 a.m., the first production line in Austin shut down. Workers were told to go home. No timeline was given for resumption. At 1:23 p.m., Fremont followed. And at 2:03 p.m., Tesla's Nevada battery facility, which supplies the Gigafactory, also halted operations. In less than 5 hours, Canada turned off lithium exports and Tesla stopped making cars. Hit that like button right now if you understand what just happened. A G7 democracy just used critical mineral supply as a coercive tool against the United States. The algorithm decides what breaks through. You decide whether this analysis reaches people who need to see it. Because what I am showing you is the weaponization of the energy transition. The minerals required to build batteries, solar panels, and wind turbines are now leverage. And countries that control processing capacity have discovered they can shut down entire industries overnight. At 2:37 p.m., the White House press secretary was asked about Canada's lithium suspension. Quote, we are in urgent discussions with Canadian officials. The United States and Canada have been allies for over a century. We expect this issue to be resolved quickly through diplomatic channels. But at 3:15 p.m., sources inside the Canadian government told Reuters that the suspension is not a negotiating tactic. It is a policy response to what Canada views as systematic exclusion from U.S. EV subsidies under the Inflation Reduction Act. Canada argues that the IRA incentivizes domestic battery production while penalizing Canadian mineral processors through content requirements that favor U.S. facilities. At 4:47 p.m., the U.S. Trade Representative's office released a statement, quote, Canada's unilateral suspension of lithium exports violates USMCA provisions on critical minerals. The United States is reviewing all available remedies, including tariff responses and WTO dispute mechanisms. We call on Canada to reverse this decision immediately. That statement suggests the U.S. is considering retaliation, but retaliation against Canada means risking even broader supply disruptions because Canada also exports nickel, cobalt, and graphite, all critical to battery production. Drop a comment right now. Tell me if you think Canada has the leverage to force U.S. policy changes, or if the U.S. will find alternative lithium sources fast enough to avoid capitulation. I am reading every response because this question will determine whether the energy transition is controlled by markets or by governments willing to weaponize supply chains. At 5:34 p.m., Tesla's investor relations team sent a memo to major shareholders. Quote, "Production suspension is temporary. We are exploring lithium hydroxide sources in Australia, Chile, and Argentina. We expect to resume operations within 2 weeks." But sources in the lithium industry say that alternative sourcing takes months, not weeks. Australian lithium hydroxide is already contracted to Chinese battery makers. Chilean supplies are committed to European automakers. Argentina has capacity, but logistics and quality certification require 90 to 120 days. Tesla's claim of a 2-week resolution is optimistic at best, and investors know it. Tesla stock fell 11% in after-hours trading. Subscribe to this channel right now if you have not already, because what I am about to show you is the mathematics of lithium dependency and why the United States cannot replace Canadian supply quickly. The United States consumes approximately 92,000 metric tons of lithium hydroxide annually for EV battery production. Canada supplies 67,000 metric tons, which is 73% of U.S. consumption. Australia produces lithium but ships most of it to China for processing. Chile exports lithium carbonate, not hydroxide, which requires additional conversion. Argentina is scaling up, but current capacity is only 14,000 metric tons annually, and it is already contracted. That means if Canada maintains the suspension for 30 days, U.S. automakers will face production cuts of at least 60%. If the suspension lasts 90 days, the entire domestic EV industry halts. Tesla, GM, Ford, and Rivian all depend on Canadian lithium hydroxide. None of them have diversified supply chains sufficiently to weather a prolonged cutoff. And here is the critical point. Even if the U.S. government orders emergency lithium procurement from Australia or South America, it takes 60 to 90 days to ship, process, and integrate new supply into production lines. There is no quick fix. Here is what we are watching for over the next 14 days. 6 indicators that will tell us whether this crisis escalates or resolves. Indicator 1, does Canada soften its position in bilateral talks? If Minister Wilkinson signals willingness to resume partial exports while negotiations continue, it suggests Canada is using leverage, not punishment. Indicator 2, does the U.S. offer concessions on IRA battery content requirements? If the Biden administration announces regulatory changes favoring Canadian processors, it means the U.S. is prioritizing supply stability over domestic content mandates. Indicator 3, does Tesla or other automakers announce alternative lithium sourcing? If contracts with Australian or Chilean suppliers are confirmed, it reduces Canadian leverage. Indicator 4, do U.S. lawmakers propose retaliatory tariffs on Canadian goods? If Congress pushes for trade retaliation, it signals the U.S. is willing to escalate rather than negotiate. Indicator 5, does China offer to supply lithium hydroxide to U.S. automakers? If Chinese battery companies propose emergency exports, it forces the U.S. to choose between dependency on Canada or dependency on China. Indicator 6, does public opinion in Canada support the export suspension? If Canadian polls show majority approval, Wilkinson has political cover to maintain the policy. If opposition grows, he may face pressure to reverse. Here are the 3 scenarios. Scenario 1, diplomatic resolution within 30 days. The U.S. and Canada negotiate revised IRA battery content rules. Canada allows partial lithium exports to resume while talks continue. Tesla restarts production after a 2-week suspension. The crisis becomes a case study in allied mineral diplomacy, but the underlying dependency remains unresolved. This is the compromise scenario where both sides claim victory, but the structural vulnerability persists. Scenario 2, prolonged standoff with economic pain. Canada maintains the suspension for 60 to 90 days. Tesla, GM, and Ford announce layoffs. U.S. automakers lose market share to Chinese EV manufacturers who are not affected by the cutoff. The Biden administration faces pressure to either capitulate to Canadian demands or subsidize emergency lithium procurement from non-allied sources. This is the attrition scenario where both economies suffer, but Canada believes it can outlast U.S. political tolerance for EV industry collapse. Scenario 3, full supply chain decoupling. The U.S. retaliates with tariffs on Canadian nickel and cobalt. Canada expands the suspension to include all battery minerals. U.S. automakers pivot entirely to Chinese supply chains despite national security concerns. The North American EV industry fragments. Canada redirects lithium exports to Europe and Asia. The U.S.-Canada trade relationship suffers long-term damage. This is the fracture scenario where short-term leverage destroys decades of integrated supply chains. Subscribe right now, like this video, comment with your prediction. Which scenario happens? I am tracking all three, and as the crisis unfolds, you will see the analysis here immediately. Let me show you why this has never happened before. Canada and the United States have the most integrated trade relationship in the world. Two-way trade totals $790 billion annually. The USMCA was designed to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral export restriction. But the agreement includes a critical minerals exemption that allows either country to suspend exports if it determines that domestic industry is being harmed by trade imbalances. Canada is invoking that exemption, arguing that U.S. subsidies under the IRA constitute trade harm. The United States has never faced a supply cutoff from a G7 ally. OPEC oil embargoes in the 1970s came from adversaries. Rare earth restrictions from China in 2010 came from a strategic competitor. But lithium suspension from Canada is different. This is a democratic ally using the same coercive tools that authoritarian regimes deploy. And it is working because the United States built its EV industry on the assumption that friendly countries would always supply critical minerals. What I know for certain right now, Canada suspended lithium hydroxide exports at 9:34 a.m. Tesla halted production by 11:47 a.m. The U.S. government is in crisis talks but has no short-term alternative supply. Tesla claims it can resolve this in 2 weeks. Industry experts say 90 days minimum. And Canada has made clear this is not a negotiating bluff. This is a policy designed to force structural changes in U.S. trade law. The energy transition was supposed to reduce dependency on hostile regimes. It was supposed to make supply chains more resilient. Instead, we are discovering that batteries require minerals, minerals require processing, and processing is concentrated in a handful of countries that can now shut off supply whenever trade disputes arise. The United States is learning that energy independence in the EV era does not come from drilling oil. It comes from controlling lithium, cobalt, and nickel supply chains. And right now, the United States does not control them. Stay with this channel. Turn on notifications. When Canada and the U.S. reach a deal, or when Tesla announces layoffs, or when this crisis forces a fundamental rethink of EV supply chains, you will see the analysis here. This is not over. This is the beginning of mineral geopolitics in the energy transition. And every country with battery materials just learned that export controls work.